Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you listening to this Focus Consulting Group's Hit It and Quit It webinar. Today is Focus Selection, Creating the Perfect Partnership. And so this really is to give you a little overview of what we think is, and what we've proven to have, is a unique approach to bringing people into the organization, to bringing candidates in, the right candidate in. And what we want to do is we want to talk a little bit about, so what happens in this process? Because it's one of those processes that people tend to take for granted, but it is literally the most important process in a firm. So what are we going to be up to this afternoon? Well, we're going to talk a little about the hiring imperative, which basically means what happens when you do it wrong. We want to talk about the last place you will ever work. So it's great to get talent in the door, but as we know, this generation of talent that is now becoming more and more important in our industry, they vote with their feet faster than any other generation has before them. So how do we get them in, and how do we get them to stay, and how do we have them have the feeling of, this is the last place I ever want to be? We want to talk about, how do we increase success? In other words, how do we increase success in identifying the right person that will be here for a long, long time? And then finally, some mechanics, because by the way, just like an investment process or a sales process or an operations process or a finance process, this is a process-driven approach to bringing talent in the door. And if you do it right, it will be the last place they will ever want to work. So we certainly want to make sure we identify the right talent and bring them in, because we know what happens when we do it wrong. So let me just throw a couple stats at you. For example, the number 25, you might want to remember these numbers, by the way. The number 25, that's the average cost to recruit somebody into the organization. And by the way, it's 25% of total compensation. So if you think about, $100,000 person, you're spending $25,000 to get them in the door. So granted, you might say, well, okay, $25,000, that's a reasonable trade, but it only gets more expensive from there. And oh, by the way, screw it up a few times and you're going to start to get numbers like this. 50% of an entry-level person's salary is what it costs you if you do it wrong. So you bring somebody in the door for $100,000 and you have to turn around and let them go. 50% is wasted. So 25% to get them in, and then 50% on top of that when you make a bad hiring decision. Not to mention all the pain and anguish, frankly, that goes along with a bad hiring decision. Now you start to heap a little experience on this, a 5 to 10-year person. And believe it or not, the percentage goes down. Well, why does the percentage go down? So 30% of salary to make a bad hire at a mid-level. Well, why? Because it takes them less time to ramp up. So you invest less in them on the front end in terms of training costs and things like that, but you still have a lot of pain. And that's really what we're trying to prevent, is the pain. Now, here's the number that I really like. Kind of a random number, 213. So if you make a bad executive hiring decision, by the way, it costs you 213% of total compensation. Let me say that again, 213% of total compensation. So to make a bad executive hire, senior PM, a C-suite position, 213% of total compensation. And you want to talk about some pain? That is a painful process when we make bad decisions in that regard. So the hiring imperative is, how do we avoid all of this? Well, there are three big mistakes that we make. And we do it because we're not planful. We don't really think about this. Now, some of you may be out there saying, well, I really do think about hiring and I really take it seriously. Good for you. So let me lay these three on you and see what you think. So for example, one of the biggest hiring decisions we make, which underpowers our firm, is that we hire people just like us. So we have to resist hiring ourselves. Well, how does that happen? It happens because as human beings, we are stuck with our biases. And usually they're unconscious biases. And we wind up hiring people that we have an affinity to, who, by the way, have the same set of core values. Well, that's okay, but the same personality and so on. And so that's one hiring mistake that we really want to make sure we don't make, is we want to resist hiring people who are just like us. Well, the second hiring mistake we make is that we don't really think about cognitive diversity. Now, we know that diversity, equity, inclusion are an important aspect of how we do business now and how we will do business in the future. By the way, they've always been an important aspect. Maybe we've just given them a little short shrift, but not at Focus Consulting, because we use a tool like this. This is called the Enneagram tool. We use a tool like this to help actually get more diversity into the organization. Cognitive diversity comes from a variety of places, part of which is personality styles, background, culture, experience. And often, because we hire people who are like us, we hire ourselves, we fail on the diversity imperative, the ability to bring people in and give them the opportunity to flourish. So that's the second mistake. We don't give this enough time and attention. The third mistake, we do things from the gut, right? I've worked with numerous clients who say, we got through our process, the focus selection process, and they think, oh man, we would just kind of do this from our gut. Well, we would say, get out of the gut and get into the brain, because hiring, like many other investment processes, and we would say hiring is an investment process. It's an investment in your talent in the organization. So treat it like an investment. More on that in a minute. So don't go from the gut, go from the brain. And so we're going to teach you in the next 12 minutes or so, give you a little bit of insight of, well, how do we exactly go about doing that? Well, remember, one of the objectives is we want this to be the last place anybody will want to be. So in other words, get them in and keep them in. And we recognize that the next two generations that will dominate the workforce, if I told my kids, who are all millennials, by the way, hey, oh, by the way, you're going to work somewhere for 25 years and then you get your gold watch and off you go, they would be apoplectic. That is the worst thing that they want. So how do we get them in and get them engaged? Well, it all comes down to your culture and defining your culture in a very, very specific way. So the first thing we need to be thinking about as leaders is, how do we get rid of the deficiency needs? In other words, 3 fears: security, approval, and control. We need to create a culture that helps people feel secure. So we need to have values, behaviors, and approaches within the organization that help people feel like, hey, I can come in and be myself. Back to the diversity imperative, right? I can come in, I can be myself, I can truly be who I want to be. That's a cultural initiative, and it's something we need to be thoughtful about, because that creates the next piece, which is belonging. That goes to the approval need, right? The approval fear. If I feel like I'm belong and I'm connecting, then I'm not fearful about approval. And then certainly around control, which really is, can I develop and do things the way I want to do them? Dan Pink uses the word mastery, right? We would never want Picasso to paint by numbers. We want Picasso to paint a great painting. And by the way, with our talent, we want the same thing. So as leaders, we need to create a culture that is sticky, because we've addressed these 3 deficiency needs, and we've created the final piece: something that has meaning, something that allows me to feel like I get up every day and I go in, and I'm not digging a hole and filling it back in, but I'm doing something that's really meaningful, that's purposeful. Whether that's individually to me, like working in the markets is fun, it's engaging, or whether it's something like I get to work within society, or I contribute to the wealth care of our clients, whatever the meaning is. As leaders, if we can articulate it and we can define it, those people that share that common purpose will be drawn to our firm, and that they will stay there. And by the way, we need to interview for that. We need to understand that, which sort of gets us to the next piece, which is, often we approach interviewing as lie detection. We're looking to see where they're going to screw up or where they're going to make mistakes. We would say, think about it a little differently. What we're really looking at in our techniques and our approach and focus selection is truth detection.
against Montgomery Burns?
No. All right, maybe I did, but I didn't shoot him.
Checks out. Okay, sir, you're free to go.
Good, because I got a hot date tonight. Odd date. Dinner with friends. Dinner alone. Watching TV alone. All right. I'm gonna sit at home and ogle the ladies in the Victoria's Secret catalog. Sears catalog. Now, would you unhook this already, please? I don't deserve this kind of shabby treatment.
I don't deserve this kind of shabby treatment. Have you ever wondered if somebody walked out of an interview with your organization and said, boy, I didn't deserve that kind of shabby treatment? It felt unprepared. It felt unstructured. The questions were kind of odd and strange. All sorts of interesting experiences from people that we talk to who walk out of organizations going, well, what was that all about? Well, remember, this isn't about lie detection. It's not about catching somebody. It's not about making them uncomfortable. It's about truth detection. It's about eliminating that little image that you see there on the screen. Remember, in an interview, people will be as good as they will ever get, despite the fact that they're nervous. But nerves, by the way, can sometimes be misleading if we're lie detecting. So let's get to truth detecting. And what are some techniques that allow us to do that? Well, first we start with the questioning. What sort of questions are we asking? Are we asking questions that focus on behaviors and causes, or behaviors and outcomes? Or are we asking questions that come to outcomes and effects? Because what I want to understand is, did their past behavior get them the results that we're looking for in this role? Will their past behavior be aligned with our values as an organization, a good cultural fit? Will their past behavior and experiences help me understand what they will likely do in the future? Because what we know is that past behavior is an indicator, not an absolute, but an indicator of future behavior. So let's focus on two things. One, let's focus on past behavior and their ability to translate that to outcomes and effects. And let's do it in a way that is a little bit different, that it causes them to really think about and rely on what they've actually done as opposed to what they want you to hear. And that's the key, right? I tell you what I think you want to hear, but the reality is I want to know what I want to know. I don't want to know what you think I want to know. Put that in your pipe and smoke it. So what do we have to do? Well, traditional interviews typically are based on opinion, non-specificity, direct questions and behavioral questions, by the way, that people can prepare for. If you go out and you Google behavioral-based questions, behavioral descriptive interviewing, you can find guides that will tell you how to answer behavior-based questions. And for years, behavioral descriptive interviewing was, the creme de la creme. Oh, that's the way you get at the truth. Well, it used to be, but talent has evolved beyond that. So we layer in behavioral descriptive interviewing, which is good because it does give you the idea of past behavior, but we layer in what we call IC interviews, or indirect context interviews, which allow us to put the individual into a space that they aren't expecting. Now, what we want to avoid are the ridiculous, right? So believe me, you can't make this stuff up. I actually had a group of managers, I won't say where, asking questions like, well, if you were a tree, what kind of tree would you be? And they thought that was a really clever question. Or if you were an animal, what kind of animal would you be? Well, you see in this little thing here with the gray and the blue circle, right, a little Venn diagram, those are indirect questions that serve up a whole bunch of oblivious answers. We might get answers we think are insightful. They're not, they're BS, and they're all made up. So what we want to do is we want to create an indirect question that is less obvious, but gives us what we're looking for. Now, these are a lot more challenging to create than what I can describe right here. But the whole idea of IC interviews is we take behavioral-based interviews, past behavior is a predictor of future behavior, and we put that together with indirect context questions, which are questions like, so which of our values would you feel most aligned with? Now, that's an indirect question. It's going to tell you whether they did their homework or not. Did they actually look at the values on the website? Do they understand what we stand for as an organization? And if they do, can they actually tell us what our values are? And then we ask a behavioral follow-up question. So tell me about a situation when, let's imagine they pick collaboration. Tell me about a situation when you struggled to collaborate with your colleagues. Describe the situation and tell me how you dealt with it. So that is actually putting together an indirect question that gives you an answer that you can then make a behavioral question out of. So we start to gather more data in that blue space, which is really what we're looking for. It's less obvious, so I can't prepare as well, but it allows me then to give you an answer that is really more truth-driven than baloney-driven, right? So that is a technique that we teach, and that is a technique that we know statistically produces better candidates with a higher likelihood of success. And that's what we're looking for. We want somebody that's going to have a 90% chance of doing the job rather than a 10% chance of doing a job. Traditional interviewing gives you that 10%. What we do gives you the 90% success rate. Okay. So you don't just do this from the hip. Planning makes perfect. So this is a process, and it is something that you need to be careful in how you actually put it together. So we believe, first of all, in team interviewing. Now, you don't want the Spanish Inquisition, because remember, we want to remove fear. This is about truth detection, not lie detection. So we would say you want to use interviewing teams of 2, ideally, 3 at the most. And we want to let the candidate know that we each have a role to play in the interview process. So certainly team interviewing helps, and that needs to be coordinated, right? We don't want to just keep peppering them with questions. We actually want to make it almost like a jazz band. We're each going to play our part when our solo comes up. And it allows us to create comfort in the potential employee, the candidate, but also get at the data that we really need to get at. So what is the kind of data we're looking for? Well, we're shooting for stars. So we want them in their answer to describe the situation. What really happened in the situation? What did they do behaviorally to address the predicament, to address the situation, solve the problem, whatever it is? And we were looking and listening for the word I. A very common dodge is we talk about collaboration and they use the word we. And I don't really know, they're going we all the way home, but the reality is I have no idea what they did. So the idea of the team interview is I pick up on the we indicator and I may say, that's important to understand what the team did, but I really want to know what your role was. Can you tell me specifically what you did? So the team interview allows us to pay attention to different things that might be driven by bias or that might be driven by obfuscation, right? And then finally, what was the result? Because at the end of the day, it's the result that matters. So everybody in this team interview has a role to play. One of us might be the lead on a series of questions. The other one's in asking the follow-up questions and taking notes. And maybe somebody else is actually scoring. We actually do collect data in this process. Well, why do we collect data? Because we want the best fit in our portfolio. And what are we looking for? We're looking for conviction and evidence. I can have high conviction about collaboration, or I can have high conviction about portfolio construction or about operational process, but I have no evidence that I can actually do it, right? What I really want is I want the evidence that shows the output. High conviction and good, strong evidence, past behavior, gets me to candidate 2. So I look at candidate 3, and by the way, we actually have a tool that allows you to map all of this evidentiary. I get to this and I go, well, candidate 3, yeah, high conviction, not much evidence. Candidate 1, a little lower on conviction, but better on evidence. So maybe I like candidate 1 better than candidate 3, but ooh, look at candidate 2. Strong evidence, strong conviction. Likelihood of a better fit, both from a values perspective, because remember, we're going to query on our culture, as well as from a technical perspective. That gets me where I want to go. So to wrap up, what are we looking for? We're looking for someone who will stay with the organization from the beginning to the end. Ideally, we want to reduce those numbers, those 25, 50, 213. The only way we do it is we create a process that helps us invest in our talent portfolio by creating a process that allows us to get evidence, to look at conviction, and to eliminate our own bias of hiring just like us. So join us next time when we're going to do dealer's choice. And we're going to ask you to ask us, what is it you'd like to know about the industry, about COVID, about diversity? You pick the topic, we'll provide the answers. So we're going to come solicit you for questions over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And we're going to ask you to ask us, what would you like to know? And the who will be dealer's choice. It's going to base on our expertise and our genius as to who is actually providing the next webinar. So we look forward to seeing you June 24th, noon Central Time. Thanks very much. Have a great weekend.